I don't know. That's quite an undertaking. I mean, especially if you're talking.
The morning sun streamed gently through the windows. Inside, Paul Walker sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and laughing softly with his mother and niece. It was just another quiet moment in a life filled with roaring engines, film sets, and worldwide fame. No cameras, no red carpet, just family. Hours later, the world would lose one of its brightest stars. When news broke of Paul's fatal crash, headlines exploded with shock. But what few knew was that on the very day of his death, Paul had spent his final hours with the woman who had shaped his entire world, his mother, Cheryl Walker. Behind the action hero, behind the fame, was a son who never stopped being her little boy. Today, we look beyond the flames of that tragic wreck to the roots, the quiet beginnings, and the family that raised Paul Walker. Because to understand the man the world lost, we must first understand the parents who made him.
Before he was Brian O'Connor, the fast-driving, heart-throbbing undercover cop in The Fast and the Furious, Paul William Walker IV was just a sun-kissed California kid with ocean salt in his hair and dreams flickering behind bright blue eyes. Born on September 12, 1973 in Glendale, California, Paul grew up in a modest working-class household. He was the eldest of 5 siblings, a big brother in every sense. His father, Paul William Walker III, was a sewer contractor and a former amateur boxing champion. His mother, Cheryl Crabtree Walker, was once a fashion model, but later devoted herself entirely to raising the family. There were no silver spoons, just packed lunches, shared bedrooms, and lessons in hard work and humility. Paul's first taste of the spotlight came early. By age 2, he was appearing in television commercials. He would later reflect that acting wasn't a calling, it was something they did to help make ends meet. But the camera loved him. With boyish charm and an easy presence, he naturally transitioned into television shows and small film roles through the 1980s and 1990s. His breakthrough came in 2001 when he was cast opposite Vin Diesel in The Fast and the Furious. The movie's surprise success turned Paul into an international star overnight. With each sequel, his fame soared, but his attitude didn't. While others got lost in the rush of Hollywood, Paul stayed grounded. He still surfed, he still drove his own cars, he still hung out with his childhood friends. But Paul Walker wasn't just a movie star. Beneath the muscles and high-speed chases was a man with a deep, genuine heart. He held a strong passion for marine biology, even studied it in college, and once joined a National Geographic expedition to study great white sharks. In 2010, after witnessing the devastation caused by the earthquake in Haiti, he founded Reach Out Worldwide, WROW, a disaster relief organization providing rapid response aid to global crisis zones. He didn't just sign checks. He flew to the front lines, got his hands dirty, helped rebuild homes, and handed out supplies himself. Fans adored him not just for his looks or roles, but for how real he was. Crew members described him as the guy who stayed late to help clean up. Fellow actors called him a brother. He wasn't loud or flashy, but he showed up, he gave, he cared. And yet, behind the calm exterior and philanthropic work, there was a private side few ever saw, a deeply rooted connection to his family, especially to his mother. She wasn't just the woman who drove him to auditions or packed his school lunches. She was his anchor, his reminder of where he came from, and perhaps of where he belonged. Because before the fame, before the cars and cameras, Paul Walker was a son. And in the end, it's that identity that shaped everything else.
To understand Paul Walker is to understand the woman who stood behind him, not with fanfare or fame, but with quiet strength and unwavering love. Cheryl Crabtree Walker never chased Hollywood. In her younger days, she was a fashion model known for her grace and soft-spoken elegance. But when Paul was born, her world shifted entirely. She traded photo shoots for diaper changes, studio lights for the hum of home life. Modeling was no longer the goal. Motherhood was. And in that role, she was relentless. Raising 5 children in a working-class neighborhood in California was no easy feat. Her husband, Paul Walker III, worked long hours as a sewer contractor, a tough, unforgiving job. But he was no ordinary man. Before becoming a contractor, he had made a name for himself as a 2-time Golden Gloves boxing champion. His fists were fast, his mind sharper, and though life turned him toward labor rather than legacy, he carried the discipline and grit of a fighter into every aspect of his life. Cheryl, meanwhile, became the soul of the home. Mornings were filled with packed lunches and last-minute homework checks. Evenings echoed with the noise of 5 children competing for attention. But Paul, the eldest, always seemed to carry something more, a sense of calm, a watchful eye. Cheryl noticed it early on. She was always looking out for the others, she once said in an interview. Even before he could talk properly, he'd try to comfort the younger ones. Seeing potential in her son, Cheryl began taking him to commercial auditions when he was just 2 years old, not to chase stardom, but to help the family. Paul's income from those early gigs paid for groceries, for clothes, for a little more breathing room. She was his first manager, his chauffeur, his wardrobe stylist, his audience. After every shoot, she would hug him and say, "It's not about what they see out there, it's who you are in here," tapping his chest. Their bond was never loud, never public. It didn't need to be. It was built over decades of late-night talks, shared prayers before big auditions, and the unspoken love between a mother who gave up the world for her son, and a son who never forgot it. But Paul's relationship with his father was equally formative, though quieter, more stoic. Paul Walker III didn't say much, but he showed everything. He taught Paul how to throw a punch, how to fix a car, how to stand up when life knocks you down. While Cheryl gave Paul warmth and wonder, his father gave him resilience. When Paul got his first car, it was his dad who spent weekends under the hood with him, sleeves rolled up, grease on his hands, laughing about nothing and everything. It was this foundation, the contrast of his parents, that shaped Paul. He inherited his father's strength and discipline, his mother's tenderness and grace. Together, they made sure that even as his fame grew, his feet stayed planted in real soil. Years later, as Paul soared to international stardom, he never let Hollywood create distance. Cheryl often visited him on set. On birthdays, he still showed up at home with flowers and hugs. And no matter where he went, Cheryl would say, he always came back to us. And then came that morning, November 30th, 2013. Paul had stopped by his mother's home. He sat with her and his niece. They talked. They laughed. He made plans to return later that evening. He hugged them both, said goodbye. He never came back. In hindsight, Cheryl would remember everything. The way he smiled that morning, the warmth in his voice, the ease in his heart. And maybe, just maybe, the universe knew. Maybe that peaceful goodbye was its final gift to a mother who had given everything.
It was supposed to be just another charity event. Just another afternoon filled with handshakes, photographs, and giving back. Something Paul Walker did often, quietly, and without cameras. On November 30, 2013, he was attending a fundraiser for his organization Reach Out Worldwide, aimed at supporting victims of Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. The venue? A warehouse in Santa Clarita, filled with car enthusiasts, friends, and purpose. The air was light. Paul joked with guests, smiled for fans, and admired the vehicles on display. Among them was a sleek red 2005 Porsche Carrera GT, rare, fast, powerful, a car that demanded precision and respect. It belonged to his friend and business partner, Roger Rodas, a professional racer and financial advisor. Around 3:30 p.m., the two decided to take the Porsche out for a quick ride, a short loop. Just a few minutes. Nothing unusual. But something went wrong. At approximately 3:45 p.m., the car was traveling north on Hercules Street, a stretch of industrial road in Valencia. Witnesses reported the roar of the engine echoing louder than usual, followed by a deafening crash and a plume of smoke rising above the trees. The Porsche had slammed into a concrete light pole and two trees before bursting into flames. When emergency services arrived, the scene was engulfed in fire. The heat was so intense, responders could barely approach. By the time the flames were extinguished, both men were pronounced dead at the scene. Roger Rodas had been driving. Paul was in the passenger seat. The autopsy later confirmed that Paul had died from the combined effects of traumatic and thermal injuries. He hadn't died instantly. That detail would haunt his family, especially his mother. The thought that, even for a moment, he had felt the flames, the pain, the fear, was unbearable. Cheryl Walker first heard the news through a phone call no parent should ever receive. Confused voices, sirens, conflicting reports. At first, she thought it was a prank. Then came the confirmation. Her son, her firstborn, her Paul, was gone. She collapsed. In interviews that followed, Cheryl would speak little of that moment, but she did recall the morning, the laughter at the breakfast table, Paul making plans to return later with food for the family. She said he was so happy that day, so full of life. The world mourned. News outlets replayed the crash site on loop. Fans gathered with candles and flowers. But for Cheryl, time had frozen. The house still echoed with his voice. His coffee cup still sat on the kitchen counter. His scent still lingered in the hallway. The speed, the fire, the violence of it all, it didn't match who Paul was. He wasn't reckless, he wasn't chasing adrenaline, he was just catching a ride with a friend. A short drive, one he never returned from. And perhaps the cruelest irony, Paul, who played a street racing legend on screen, died not in a stunt, not in a chase, but in a real-world accident that took everything away in seconds. But Cheryl, strong, steady Cheryl, never let that moment define him. She clung to that morning, to the smile, the calm, the last goodbye whispered over breakfast. Because in her heart, that was the real ending. Not fire, not metal, but love.
The sun dipped low over the hills of Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Los Angeles, casting long shadows across a gathering of mourners who spoke little and wept much. It wasn't a spectacle. It wasn't meant to be. Paul Walker's funeral, held on December 14, 2013, was as quiet and private as the man himself. Intimate, solemn, and deeply human. Only family, close friends, and select past members from the Fast and Furious franchise were allowed in. There were no red carpets, no paparazzi, just raw grief, a quiet chapel, and the steady rhythm of tears falling on folded hands. Cheryl Walker sat in the front row, her hands clutching a letter she had written but never read aloud. Her shoulders were still, but her eyes, red, distant, unblinking, carried the weight of a mother who had just buried her firstborn. On one side of her was Paul's daughter, Meadow, barely 15, trying to hold herself together in a world that had suddenly gone quiet. On the other side, Paul's siblings, silent, stunned, standing like pillars beside the woman who had once held them all in her arms. The air smelled of white lilies and sandalwood. Soft piano music floated through the chapel. A single photo of Paul stood by the altar, not a movie still, not a promotional shot, but a candid image. Paul laughing, wind in his hair, squinting into the sun. Real, untouched, exactly as Cheryl remembered him. Vin Diesel, Paul's co-star and closest friend, was among the first to speak. His voice cracked as he called Paul "my brother" on and off the screen. He shared how Paul had comforted him through personal struggles, how he always prioritized family, and how his absence would forever echo in every scene they would film thereafter. Tyrese Gibson, another castmate, wept openly, unable to finish his eulogy.
The room fell into a heavy silence. Then came the final procession. Outside, a line of high-performance cars, Supras, GTRs, Chargers, revved their engines one by one, not in arrogance, but in tribute. It was a symbolic farewell from the world Paul had helped shape, a convoy of machines, loyal and loud, escorting a legend to his final rest. Fans, though kept at a respectful distance, lined the street in silence. Many held candles, others clutched Fast and Furious DVDs. One small child held a hand-painted sign, "Ride in peace, Brian." As the casket was lowered, Cheryl stepped forward, her hands still clutching a letter she had written but never read aloud. She didn't read it aloud, she simply placed it gently atop the coffin, a quiet farewell only a mother could understand. Beside the letter, she laid a surfboard keychain and a photo of Paul at 5 years old, missing 2 front teeth, smiling without a care in the world. There were no cameras to capture her final words, but a witness later shared what she whispered as the lid closed. "You were never mine to keep forever, but thank you for every single day you stayed." The final bell tolled. The family bowed their heads, and in that moment, under the California sky, the man known to the world as a star was returned to the earth, not as a celebrity, not as a character, but as a son. A son who was loved, lost, and never forgotten.
After the funeral, silence lingered. The kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, it fills the bones. For Cheryl Walker, the days that followed were not marked by headlines or fan tributes, but by empty chairs, unread texts, and the quiet hum of a house that used to hold a laugh that now lived only in memory. Paul's death didn't just take a son, it took the center of her world. In the weeks that followed, Cheryl rarely spoke to the media. Her grief was too fresh, too sacred. But she focused on the one thing Paul had always prioritized above all else: family. Meadow, Paul's only child, became Cheryl's anchor. Together they held each other through the weight of mourning, exchanging small comforts, a hand on the shoulder, a whispered, "He would have loved this," in the middle of their storm. Paul's humanitarian legacy also gave Cheryl a direction. His organization, Reach Out Worldwide, continued its mission, not just as a charity, but as a living memory of the man who created it. Cheryl began working quietly behind the scenes, supporting Meadow and other volunteers, making sure that Paul's wish to get aid into disaster zones faster remained more than just a motto. But it wasn't all healing. In 2014, a legal dispute over Meadow's custody thrust Cheryl into public light again. As Meadow's maternal family sought guardianship, Cheryl filed for custody herself, not for control, but out of protection. She feared for her granddaughter's emotional well-being and wanted to honor the values that Paul had tried to instill. In the end, Meadow chose to live with her mother, and Cheryl respected that decision, stepping back, not in defeat, but in love. Through it all, Cheryl never let grief harden her. She continued showing up for family dinners, birthdays, quiet Christmases. She kept Paul's photos where they had always been, not as shrines, but as family. She still talked about him in the present tense. "Paul loved this dish," she'd say, or "Paul would have laughed at that." Not because she couldn't move on, but because in her heart he never truly left. Years later, when asked how she coped with such a loss, Cheryl simply replied, "You don't get over it, you walk with it, and some days it walks ahead of you. But I still hear him, in the waves, in the laughter, in the silence." Because Paul Walker didn't vanish, he just shifted from screen to spirit, from icon back to son.
Behind every movie star is a story few ever see. Not of fame, but of family. Paul Walker was more than just the face of a billion-dollar franchise. He was a son, a brother, a father. And at the heart of his journey stood 2 humble parents, a former boxer and a soft-spoken model, who built a life not of lights and cameras, but of love, sacrifice, and grounding truth. Cheryl and Paul Walker Sr. never chased Hollywood. But in raising Paul, they gave the world a man who lived with humility, gave with compassion, and left too soon. Their quiet influence echoes not only in the roles he played, but in the lives he touched, and the legacy that still breathes through Reach Out Worldwide, Meadow Walker, and the millions who still remember him. Because in the end, perhaps that's the truest measure of a parent. Not what they leave behind, but who. And you, do you remember where you were the day the world lost Paul Walker? Leave us a comment below, share your memory, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Hollywood Bloodline, where the stories behind the legends come back to life.